Hey everyone, it's Nighthawk. We're here making another Anima Squad Swarm video. Today we're going to be doing a weapons tier list based on my experiences with the game so far. This is actually my second attempt to make this video. My first attempt ended up being a little bit too long, and I actually forgot to add some of the weapons that weren't on my tier list. So trying again, we're going to try and make this a little quicker and hopefully make this a fun little tier list for everyone to maybe agree with or disagree with. We'll see what happens. So quick disclaimers before getting into it. One big one, currently there are some bugged weapons, which means that we cannot evaluate them properly. There are two weapons right now that just do not evolve because they are currently bugged. So they do not reach the peak of their power. And there's one weapon which I believe is just not working properly at its evolution, but I also just don't think it's very good. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Two disclaimers. A lot of these weapons are sort of champion dependent. Like I would pick them on one character, but I wouldn't necessarily pick them on another character. That may end up making them a little further down on the tier list than you may evaluate them on one. So, for example, the Radiant Field, the Sunfire Cape cloak item, I would rate this as really, really powerful on champions like Leona, maybe Brier, maybe Alawi, some of the tankier champions. I would not rate it very powerful on champions like Jinx or Aurora or Xayah. So that would probably result in within being in tier 2 instead of tier 1. So just keep that in mind when I'm rating an item. It doesn't mean that it's bad if it's not at the very top. It just means that it's more situational than another item. The last thing I wanted to point out is that weapons right now do not have any way to measure their individual weapon damage. A lot of these Vampire Survivor type games, they have individual weapon DPS meters. So I could look at one item and say how much damage it does versus another item. In this game mode, we only have a total damage meter. So a lot of the idea that I have about a weapon just comes from what I can see, my experience using it, how well I think it personally works based on the observations that I've had. There's really no empirical evidence that I can really base my judgment off of. So we're going to just have to go on based on that, which means that I could be rating your favorite weapon higher or lower than it should be. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's start out with one of the first weapons you can get, Uwu Blaster. Now, Uwu Blaster is a very interesting weapon. Personally, I didn't actually like it very much when I first started out. I thought it was low damage. It's only single target. It doesn't really have a lot of utility outside of just like killing one target. So I was like, oh, this is bad. This is a starter weapon. You never want to get it. Easy enough. As I played more and more, I realized that this weapon sort of serves a really important purpose. It is one of the only single target weapons on this entire list, I believe. At least one of the generalist single target weapons. So this really allows you to have something that can kill one target relatively quickly. Where that comes in handy is one, bosses, and two, there are specific enemies later on in some of the higher difficulties, the bombs and the frogs, that you really don't want to get close to you at all. You don't want to let them get close, which means that something that can target those enemies down very quickly, focus them down, is a lot more powerful than you might think. So originally, I probably would have put Uwu Blaster in only if I have to tier, but I think it actually belongs in I'll pick this usually tier. And with the caveat that I would only really pick this on a build where I was lacking boss damage or single target damage or maybe range damage. Something that comes to mind is like Leona or Brier. If I don't have something to deal with the bombs, I may end up picking up Uwu Blaster. Something that's important to note is that it evolves out of Ability Haste passive, which is a relatively strong passive for early game, early on in the meta progression. But once you start stacking up your anima power, Ability Haste becomes less and less important. You don't really need as much Ability Haste when you're already getting 120 free Ability Haste from the anima power passive. So we'll just start out with that, and we'll kind of work around Uwu Blaster to see what is better or weaker, depending on my opinion of them. So we're going to go to these cyclone things. I don't actually remember what these are called. It's sort of like a little cyclone that circles your champion. They scale off projectiles, so you can actually get a lot of them, and it evolves based on the health regen passive. So health regen is one of the stronger passives in my opinion. It's always nice to have health regen at the higher levels. Hitting yourself, like taking a really strong hit from a bomb, will be a lot easier to recover if you have health regen. So I don't normally mind picking up health regen. That being said, I'm not a huge fan of this weapon. It's fairly short range, so it sort of fills the same niche as a lot of these other short range weapons have. I don't feel like the damage is that high. It doesn't seem like it does that much DPS. And the evolution is just really not that much more powerful. It sort of just makes them larger and do more damage. So I don't really hate these at all. They're fine, but I wouldn't go out of my way to pick them. It's short range. It doesn't do a ton of boss damage. It's AoE, which is nice, but nothing special in my opinion. This is a pretty average weapon. Continuing on with the average weapons are the Lionist Chains. These are a scale off of the ability haste augment. So like Uwu Blaster, it's a fairly powerful passive early, but later on in your meta progression, you may not want to pick up the ability haste passive. And the weird thing about these is that it only hits to your left and right of your character, so it can make positioning a little bit more tricky. And even when you evolve it and it hits the entire left and right of your screen, I feel like the damage from it is just really not that good. I personally don't pick these very often. It doesn't really seem like they have much of a purpose. They don't kill bosses very quickly. The AoE is kind of weak because it only hits to your left and right. They do scale off for projectiles, at least until they evolve. I'm not sure if the projectiles matter once it evolves. So I think they're probably a little weaker than the shurikens. Moving on, we have the Gatling double guns. I actually kind of like the Gatling double guns for specific characters. I mostly only pick these on Alawi because Alawi already wants to get the duration passive, and these evolve off of the duration passive. But these sort of fill the same niche as the shurikens, except for they have CC built into them once they evolve. Once you evolve them, they slow and then stun targets that they hit over time, which it can be really powerful if you're trying to keep things at a distance from you. Not only that, the damage is quite strong for what it is. I feel like these do more damage than both of these two combined. I can't say that for sure, obviously, based on the problems that we have with the DPS system, but it kind of feels like these do quite a bit of damage. So I really like the double Gatling guns. I like their evolution. I just think that they're strong. They're strong early, they're strong late. It's a decent weapon. I'd pick this up if you're going to go duration. If you don't really care about duration, I wouldn't bother picking these up. So they're probably going to stay at the low of I usually pick this. This is the Searing Short Bow, and unfortunately at the moment this is bugged. You cannot evolve it, so we're going to put that in the bugged tier. I'm excited to see what this does evolve into and if it's powerful, but at the moment, even though I think that its non-evolved tier is pretty strong, it just really can't compete with any of the evolved weapons. So we're going to leave it down here. All right, this is probably the easiest one to evaluate in the game so far, at least for me. This is Yumibot, and I think Yumibot fits comfortably at the bottom of only if I have to tier. Yumibot unfortunately evolves off of what, in my opinion, the worst passive, the pickup radius passive. So on top of having a very weak passive that she evolves off of, her effect is just really weak. Her effect is that she goes around and picks up XP for you, and she also does like a little bit of damage and knocks up enemies in the area. When she evolves, I believe she drops like a health pack as well. But overall, her utility is really just not that useful. Your pickup radius, once you have the pickup radius passive, which you need to evolve her, is already so large that she doesn't really do much for you. You don't really need to hunt down XP. You get so many magnets and XP kind of just comes to you anyway. It's not really difficult to get it. So unfortunately, Yumi bot at the bottom of the pile for me, at least. I never really figure out if she's worth going at all. I usually don't even go where when I'm playing Xayah, which is when you do have to pick up the pickup passive. So that should tell you something. I think she's just way too weak in her current form. I think the utility of the health could be really strong in certain situations, but I haven't found it being that useful. All right, going from the worst of the worst, I think we're coming to the best of the best. This is the Static Shiv, or whatever the exact name of it is. This is, I think, maybe the best weapon in the game, and I'll say that for two reasons. Starting out, reason number one is that it is a long-range multi-target weapon, which does a pretty good amount of damage. Once it's evolved, I believe it one-shots every single base tier enemy in the game with AoE. So this weapon alone can kind of keep ads under control by itself once it's evolved. Two, and the main reason why I have it at the very top of the list, is it is so good at countering the frogs and the bombs. If you watched my last video, you know that the frogs and the bombs are the absolute bane of high difficulty Swarm. The bombs, if you're playing a squishy champion or even a tanky champion, will almost one-shot you. They will almost kill you in one hit, and there's really nothing that you can do. The radius of the bombs is so large, they move fairly quickly, and if you need something, if you don't have anything that can kill them at range, you'll quickly get overwhelmed and they'll run you down. The frogs are arguably even worse than the bombs, because once you kill the frogs, they drop a pool of damaging gunk on the floor, and that basically just means that you can't walk in that area for the next 5 seconds. And that doesn't sound too bad until you see 1,000 frogs circling you at all points. You have to dodge a skill shot coming from the sky, and you have nowhere to go because there's frog goop everywhere. So the one thing that makes the Static Shiv insanely good, and I don't know if this is a bug, but when it kills the frogs, they disappear. They don't drop the gunk. So that just alone makes it really, really powerful for me. I love taking Static Shiv. It evolves out of the health passive, so not the best passive in the game, but one of the better ones. And I would normally take this on any melee champion just to keep the bombs and the frogs away from me. And I'd even end up taking this on some other champions if I end up taking the health passive, just because it's that powerful. All right, we're going to move this down to later because it's a champion weapon. This is the Radiant Field. And this one's hard to evaluate because I think that this is going to be incredibly strong on champions like Leona and maybe even Brier or maybe even Riven. It really depends. But since it scales off of your base HP, your max HP, I should say, it ends up being fairly weak on a lot of different champions. Like, you would never really want to pick this on Xayah, on Jinx, on Aurora, on Seraphine. At least I personally wouldn't. So while I think that this is a really, really powerful item on tanks and some of the beefier melee champions, I don't really see it being that useful on other champions. Where I would really consider picking this is if I need something to do AoE in an area around me and I don't have access to like one of these other ones and I already have max health. I should say that this evolves off the max health passive, and it evolves to do AoE damage when it kills an enemy, like an enemy explodes in AoE damage or something like that. This doesn't do a ton of damage anymore. It used to do a lot of damage, but they nerfed it. So I think it's fairly niche. It probably goes above the Gatling guns, but probably below Uwu Blaster, just because I would probably never take this on a ranged champion. Okay, moving on to the Orbital Laser. The Orbital Laser is a lot of fun. Unfortunately, I feel like it is just too niche and too inconsistent to really take. This evolves off the XP upgrade, which I think is actually one of the best passives you want to get in the game, at least when you're playing solo. XP is kind of hard to come by. You really need a fully stacked XP passive to hit max level before 15 minutes. At least I have found myself needing that quite a bit. So if I'm already getting XP passive, which I am almost every game, you can consider picking this up because it already evolves off the XP passive. But the main problem with it is that the cooldown is so long. I should say that this is a weapon that basically clears your entire screen every 90 seconds, scaling down based on level and ability haste. So it's really cool, but the cooldown is so long and the damage against elites is really not that impressive. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's kind of flashy, it's kind of cool. I'm probably not going to end up picking this that often. I'll probably put it in the middle of the only if I have to tier. I'll put it above chains because it does have a better passive than chains, but I'm probably putting it below the shurikens. Kind of in the same vein as the train. I think the train is close to being the worst enemy or worst weapon in the game. And there's one major reason why. I think the train is scary. The way the train works is that it spawns a big train. It's a large train. And it runs directly at your character. And anything between it and you gets run over. And it does a lot of damage. It doesn't one-shot everything, but it does a lot of damage. But it's so inconsistent. It's not as much damage as you would think. And the fact that it spawns a really large projectile that hones in exactly at you in a game where 90% of high level is just dodging large projectiles, it sort of just distracts me most of the time. I just don't like looking at it. It makes me lose focus a lot of the times. I'll like find myself trying to dodge the train out of habit, even though it's a friendly weapon. So I take it over Yumibot most of the time, but only just barely. I think I would put it down at this. I should say this evolves based on the damage passive, which is a strong passive, and the evolution gives you gold and XP for the units that it kills. So not a very exciting evolution. I think it's kind of boring, and it's just not a very strong weapon overall on top of the downsides. So let's move on to the Battle Bunny Ballista. This is a great weapon. I love this weapon. I don't know if I'd put it above or below Uwu Blaster. I think it's a little more situation than Olden Uwu Blaster. So the way I use this weapon is, one, if I'm going a crit or projectile build, very strong in both those builds. I go this all the time on Yasuo, Xayah. I don't play Jinx very much because she's kind of bad, but if I was going to go play Jinx, I'd build this on her. Anyone who I build crit on, I kind of want to build this. I think it's pretty good. Crit, it evolves based off the crit passive, which I think is one of the stronger passives in the game. So it's never really bad to take this. It does a ton of damage. The evolution clears the entire field, basically. Very high damage in a huge circle around you. So never really bad. The one downside of the Battle Bunny Ballista is that before you evolve it, it's quite mediocre, I think. The pre-evolution is so weak that it might actually put it down to below the Radiant Field. But once you do evolve it, it becomes one of the most powerful weapons in the game. So I like this a lot. I think it's a little weak early. It's a little situational. I probably wouldn't end up taking this on like Alawi or Leona or Seraphine, maybe. Actually, I probably would take it on Seraphine. So I don't know. I'll put it above the Radiant Field, but it's definitely very close. Okay. The Frost Armor. I like the Frost Armor quite a bit. I'm going to put it above Uwu Blaster. Not quite into the S tier, but I will usually pick this weapon because, one, it offers survivability, which is not something a lot of these other weapons offer you. Survivability is sort of at a premium in this game mode, at the higher difficulties, I should say. And two, it scales off of armor, which I think is definitely one of the best passives in the game. I think armor at extreme difficulty is very valuable. It keeps you from getting one shot by a lot of the boss's attacks, especially if you're playing a squishy champion. And some of the best champions scale really well off of armor. Like Leona always wants to go armor. So for that reason, I want to put it at top of this. Dodging damage and AoE freezing enemies is really, really powerful. I just like this a lot. I take this probably more than the rest of these weapons, as long as I'm playing a champion that doesn't mind building armor. Like, I might not take this on Xayah, but I'll probably take this on Riven. I'll probably take this on Yasuo. I'm not sure. There's really not many champions I wouldn't take it on. So I'll put this at the top of, I'll usually pick this. These are the Vortex Gloves. The Vortex Gloves are cool. I like them a lot. I think they are relatively strong. They scale off of health regen, so that is sort of a cool passive to take. Like I said earlier, health regen is a fairly strong passive. They do a lot of damage. The evolution doubles the damage they do, basically. It spits out 2 balls in a counterclockwise and clockwise pattern. So it's very strong in a projectile build. If I was going to projectile passive, I would almost always get these. They scale really off crit, so another good thing for crits. They just do a lot of damage in general. A lot of these stronger weapons, they scale off of many, many things, so it's really never bad to have them. And a lot of the weaker weapons don't, which is why they're weaker, in my opinion. So Vortex Gloves, they're kind of middle of the pack in terms of what I would pick, but if I'm going to go health regen, I like to pick these up most of the time. They give you a little bit of range. They do a lot of damage. They're pretty good. Kind of in the same vein is the Moon Blaster. I forget exactly what this weapon's called. I like the Moon Blaster a lot. It evolves off of crit, which, like I said, is one of the strongest passives in the game. The evolution, I don't exactly remember what it does. I think it just makes the mortars like bigger and do more damage. So not super exciting. It's a very consistent weapon. If I'm going crit and I haven't already filled out my build with like projectiles, if I'm going like a non-projectile crit build, which is not a ton of them, maybe like Brier, I would pick this up. It's not bad by any means, but it just doesn't seem very exciting. And it's a little bad for boss damage. Like, this does not really do much against bosses, which is arguably the most important thing in the game. You kind of need a lot of things that can kill bosses. Same thing with the mine. I actually love the mine. The Shark Sea Mine is so much fun. It evolves based off the damage passive, and it evolves into the Everlasting Mob Stomper, which I think is a hilarious name. It's really fun. Basically, it will bounce infinitely between adds. As long as there's something to bounce to, it will keep bouncing and keep doing a ton of damage. So this weapon can single-handedly clear not bosses, but large groups of mobs by itself. It might not do it the fastest of all the weapons, but it will get there. And you can have multiple at a time. Like, it will keep throwing out bombs, even if they're still bouncing. So I really, really like the bombs. It has a great passive to scale off of. I think the only reason why they're not higher on this list is that their boss damage is not really that great. Unfortunately, none of the bosses can really benefit from the bouncing passive. There is usually not that many adds in the arena when the bosses are there, which I think is supposed to be a benefit for you, like, oh, less things to worry about. But honestly, it ends up being more of a detriment for a lot of characters, because there are so many characters that gain stats based on how many enemies are nearby. Like, Riven wants to get her shield based on enemies. This weapon wants to have enemies. There are other examples, but I'm blanking right now. Brier wants to heal off of enemies. So I put this middle of the pack just because not great at killing bosses, not the best at killing groups of adds, but it's really, really fun. I think it's really unique. I love the item. So we'll put it right there. I think we have our second entrance to the almost always a great choice tier. And this is the Boomerangs. The Boomerangs are really, really powerful. They evolve based on move speed, which I think is one of the stronger passives, probably tier 2, I would say, just behind like crit and damage maybe. Move speed is really, really important. You get a lot of it for free in the game right now, so it's not quite as important, but Early game, I usually like to go move speed because it helps you dodge skill shots. It helps you deal with a lot of the scarier elites that are trying to run you down. It's just a useful stat to have. So another thing that the Boomerangs have going for them is that they do a ton of damage. It shoots out 3 to 4 projectiles depending on your projectile stat, and they do just a ton of damage. They can melt elites and bosses. I really like the damage off of these Boomerangs. The evolution makes them take up your whole screen, basically. They like throw out in a huge circle around you, similar to the bunny ballista, but I feel like they do a lot more damage and they're more consistent. I like this weapon a lot early as an elite killer. I'll pick this up almost always if I'm going to build move speed, I'm going to build this item almost certainly. Coming up next is Tibbers. Tibbers is fun, but ultimately mediocre. My main problem with Tibbers is his evolve passive is bad. It's the duration passive. And there's really only one champion in the game who really wants to pick up the duration passive, and that's Alawi. And Alawi, when I'm playing Alawi, I don't even usually build Tibbers. So that should tell you how bad Tibbers is. My main problem with Tibbers is that his aggro radius, where he'll actually start attacking enemies, is very small. I feel like half the time when I have Tibbers, he's kind of just following me around and doing nothing. He won't actually go and attack the enemies when they're farther than a couple of inches away from me, or a few feet, whatever you want to measure it by. And his evolution is kind of boring. It basically just says, oh, Tibbers becomes stronger. So it just does more damage and lasts longer. Kind of a boring weapon. It's a pet, so if you wanted to do like a pet build, you could try that, but overall, not my favorite. I think if they buff his aggro radius, he will become a lot better. As of right now, I'm going to put him in the only if I have to tier. We're going to do this one real quick because it's bugged. The Animines are currently bugged. They cannot be evolved, so I cannot really evaluate them properly. They don't seem very good, though, but maybe I'm not evaluating them well. We'll see once we're able to evolve them. Okay, the Boomerangs, I like to call them. I'm not really sure exactly what they're called. They're interesting. So it is like projectiles that bounce off of the walls around you. I don't know how long they can bounce. It's like 2 or 3 times. And that's sort of like their whole gimmick. They don't really do a lot of damage. They don't track to enemies, it seems like. And their evolution is pretty boring. I don't exactly remember exactly what it does. I think it increases the amount of bounces. But my main problem with them is you are almost never in a situation where you are surrounded by walls, so they can't bounce off of anything. Like, the best way to play Swarm is to just be out in the middle of the map in the open, so you aren't getting mobbed by enemies. If you're near a wall, the enemies can spawn on top of you and kill you very quickly. Like, I never want to be near a wall in the game, so I never really want to use the bat blades, which I think ultimately puts them pretty far down the list. I don't even usually go these when I'm going a projectile build. Like, these evolve off of the projectile passive, and I barely ever go these even when I'm playing a projectile build. So not a fan of them in their current state. We'll see if they get any better. These are something I'm a little confused on. I believe these are currently bugged. These are the Paw Print Poisoners. It's basically singed Q. It like leaves a trail of poisonous gas behind you. It's a really big damaging trail. Like, the size is large, but the damage itself is pretty lackluster. And the evolution doesn't seem to work properly. It says it gives you a small shield based on damaging enemies, but I've not been able to notice if the shield actually ends up showing up or not. And I've tried these a couple times and I still haven't seen the shield. So I think these are currently bugged. So we're going to put them in the bugged tier. Even if they weren't bugged, I kind of feel like they would be pretty far down into this tier anyway, because it just doesn't seem like they're that useful. Dealing damage to enemies behind you is sort of awkward to make work, and it just doesn't do that much damage to begin with. So not much to say about the Paw Print Poisoner. It evolves off move speed, so it's a good passive, but unfortunately just a lackluster weapon. That is actually the last of the real generic weapons. Now we're going to come quickly to the champion weapons. So the champion weapons are weapons that you can only acquire per specific champion. You cannot get these on other champions. So we're going to start out with Jinx's Gatling Gun. Jinx's Gatling Gun is bad. It evolves based off ability haste, just like Uwu Blaster. But the evolution is so clunky. It shoots like a really, really long line of projectiles, but you can't aim the projectiles midstream. So what ends up happening is that you shoot a large stream of projectiles, you miss the enemy because you weren't aiming properly or they moved, and you can't aim your next set of projectiles until after this one's done, which can be like 2 seconds later. Ends up being really, really clunky feeling. Doesn't feel like the damage is that high. And since Jinx is such a lackluster character, a mediocre character anyway, it doesn't feel very exciting to use. So she's going to go at the bottom once we add the rest of these weapons. Seraphine's Wave Blaster thing. I like this weapon a lot. It's really cool because it scales off projectiles. It evolves off projectiles. There aren't many other projectile weapons in the game. I think the only one that evolves off their projectiles are the bat blades, and they suck. So I really like hers. Seraphine looks like she might be a support character, but she actually ends up being sort of like the projectile character because of her passive. And this is a really cool weapon based on that. The evolution is awesome. It like spawns a huge bunch of waves around you that like come back towards you. It's really cool. It's very visually impressive. They do a decent amount of damage. Great AoE. Not great at killing bosses, but just a really fun weapon in general. I think it makes Seraphine really unique to play. And such a step up from Jinx, too. Like, if you go from playing Jinx, you're like, oh, man, I don't know if I like this game. And then you play Seraphine, you're like, oh, I get it now. It's a lot of fun. So I like Seraphine's weapon a lot. Not exactly sure where it's going to rank up to, versus all these. We'll decide that going on. Okay. Next, we have Leona's weapon. Leona's weapon is a little boring, not necessarily weak, just kind of boring. It does like it's a shield bash. It does like decent damage in a cone every second or so, depending on your attack haste. And that's about it. There's not much else to it. It evolves based off the armor passive, which is a strong passive, but the evolution is so hard to evaluate. It basically gives you Leona passive, which means that enemies that get damaged by the shield blast have a debuff, which makes them take more damage from either your allies or your other weapons. How much damage? Nobody knows. It doesn't tell you, and there's no real way to tell because there's no visual clarity in this game mode, unfortunately. So pretty hard to evaluate the shield bash. I don't really feel like it's bad. It's pretty boring, and the evolution is pretty boring as well. Not necessarily bad, just boring. Okay, moving on to Illaoi. Illaoi has got to be my favorite champion weapon. Just like watching the tier list yesterday, Illaoi's my favorite character. This is my favorite weapon. It basically spawns a tentacle on the ground every few seconds, and that tentacle will stay for a predetermined amount of time and slam at enemies fairly often. So you can set up sort of like a base around you with a ton of tentacles and just murk bosses. It's so much fun. Great weapon. It evolves off of ability. No, sorry. It evolves off of duration, which is not really my favorite passive, but it's such a strong weapon and it's so powerful that I think that it single-handedly brings like the duration passive up a notch. So not a ton you can say about this weapon. It's just really, really good in my opinion. The evolution is insane. It spawns a giant tentacle, which is huge damage, huge AoE, really, really good weapon. So we'll just leave it at that. Brier. Brier is probably middle of the pack. I like her weapon a lot. It's like a little melee AoE. It scales off max health, which is a good passive, but not exactly the most exciting one. The evolution adds a stacking bleed to it, which makes her a surprisingly good boss killer late game. I think this champion weapon kind of suffers from the same problem I said Brier suffered from in the other video. It's just not very good against bosses. I mean, I shouldn't say that. It's good against bosses. It's bad at dealing with champions like Aatrox, the boss Aatrox, because getting close to Aatrox is very difficult. His attack pattern makes it very difficult to like stay on top of him. So it's really rough to use this weapon against them. Against everything else in the game except for bombs and frogs, this weapon's great. But versus some of the bosses like Aatrox, it's just not that exciting. And it's sort of boring. The evolution makes the weapon area huge, which is exciting, but not as cool as these other two, I think. Next up, Riven's weapon. Riven's weapon's pretty cool. It's pretty unique in being a weapon that casts based on your movement. So it won't automatically go off if you're just standing still. You have to be moving, which makes her a little bit more active than most of the other champions. You kind of have to be doing something to make the best of use of her weapon. I will say right now, it feels a little weak. They've nerfed Riven pretty hard to the point where I'm not a huge fan of her. And the evolution is kind of boring. It like leaves behind a little echo of where you were, which does damage again. So it can stack a lot of damage, but it just ends up being not that much fun for me personally. I think a lot of people probably like Riven. I don't like Riven that much. So you would probably rank this higher if you like Riven, but if you don't, this is about where it would belong. The evolution is based off move speed too, so it's a decent passive, just not that exciting. Okay, here are Aurora's basic attack, and this one is almost as bad as Jinx. The only reason I think it's better than Jinx is one, it's way easier to control, but that's sort of its downside as well. This is like a little Yumi Q that follows your cursor around. So you'll use your cursor to like steer where it goes. Unfortunately, that means that you basically have to be steering this at all times, which means that you have to be paying attention to both where your character is and where Aurora's hexes are. It evolves based off of XP. Yes, XP. So it's a good passive, but overall the damage is not really good versus single targets. And the AoE requires so much extra effort that I don't really think it's very worth it. So I'm going to put this down here. Yasuo's Q. Yasuo is really, really fun. I think Yasuo is probably right here. So his works a little bit like Riven, where you kind of have to move around to throw the tornadoes out. But there are ways to like get around that. Like you don't have to do that. So I'm going to put this up here. Honestly, it's probably more fun than Seraphine. We're going to put this right here. The evolution scales off of crit, which is one of the best passives. So it's really easy to pick that up. And the evolution is like makes the tornadoes go out in a circle and like kind of swarm around you. Really, really cool looking. I think the major downside is the visual clarity goes out the window when you play Yasuo. Yasuo builds are impossible to see. Just like its entire, he's like in a tornado, which I guess makes sense. He's in like a tornado the entire time. So like you'll see a Yasuo move around the map with just a giant circle of clutter around him. And that's fine until you have to like see skill shot drops on the ground. Like there'll be a red circle on the ground that you can't stand in. Good luck seeing that red circle with Yasuo. So Yasuo's weapon gets rated this high because it's really, really fun and really pretty strong. But the visual clarity makes it fairly annoying. And last, but definitely not least, is Xayah's weapon. Xayah's weapon is okay. It's not that exciting. It's like a bunch of feathers that go out and they kind of stick in the ground, and you can pull them back with your E to do a lot of damage. This weapon does do an absolute crap ton of damage. And the evolution is based on pickup area. Okay, that's one of the major reasons why I don't like it. Pickup area is the weakest passive in the game by far. So it's sort of just like brought down a peg just because of that. But also this weapon is just not that interesting. It scales really well with her ability. Obviously, pulling the feathers back is strong. It can do a ton of damage to a single target or a small group of targets, but it requires some positioning. It has a weak passive. It takes a while to scale up. And I just don't think it's quite as like visually interesting and like fun to play as some of these other characters. But that's definitely probably personal preference. I think you could rate this much higher or lower based on what you think, because I think it belongs around the middle of the pack. All right. Hopefully that wasn't too long. We got through all the weapons for real this time. We didn't miss any, hopefully. If you like this game mode, please tell Riot. Riot really needs to get positive feedback for this game mode so we can get it either a permanent or maybe a rotation every now and then with new characters and new weapons and stuff. I really hope that Riot sees such a positive reaction to this game mode and decides to make it more permanent, because I'm really enjoying it. I love it. It's my favorite game mode in a long time for League. And I think a lot of you guys are out there enjoying it too. So I think there's not much else we can talk about for Swarm in the coming future. We may do like build guides, like what I would build on Leona or what I would build on Yasuo to get to Aatrox Extreme. But honestly, we might wait until it comes out on live to make sure we're not missing on any balance changes. I kind of just wanted to get these out because some people were asking me in the comments to do a tier list, and I thought it'd be fun. So thanks for watching, everyone. Appreciate you sticking with me through however long this took. And hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you.